and they can take attendance. You can't mark your own attendance. You have to be a leader. And so if someone comes around and says, "Hey, who are you?" Be nice to them because you're probably new at work here, like Lance and Bob Porter and others are going to be new, and they're going to help take attendance. Let me remind you that on the group, if you go to your Hill Church app and and you get your groups, and then you click, you're already in Genesis. If you've joined it, if you've not joined, click Join Group. If you're already a member, click View Group. There's a drop-down menu. It says Message or Resources. If you'll click Resources, I have links to various books that I do recommend you read. I've also got a link to a video series. So it's under Small Groups. You see the group and click Resources, and you'll see it. And those are good resources to go to. If you like the Old Testament or understanding the Bible well at all, another thing you can do, this is not on your small group, but if you go to discipleship resources on your app, you'll see a link that says Old Testament background, and there's free videos from John Walton and some others, and I can't believe it's free. So use those resources as much as you can. So the small group Genesis has links to Genesis specific stuff. Discipleship resources has Old Testament, New Testament, prayer, a bunch of stuff on your app. The Old Testament's really good. It's all really good. Good. Any question or comments for me about Genesis before we commence? Anything at all? Yeah. Amway was last week. You missed it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Good questions. No, no, ma'am, I don't think that. Greg, are the lights all the way up? Thank you. She had a question about something I said in the sermon, which was my comparison between crosses and the electric chair. And Sharon's asking, does that mean I think we shouldn't wear the cross and jewelry? No, what I said was that the cross has been domesticated. There's no more scandal associated with it because it is simply now used as jewelry. It's been domesticated. It means it's no longer shocking or shameful or horrific when we see it. So by analogy, a better analogy to commence with shame and despair and sadness and whatever would be something like an electric chair or a guillotine or a hangman's noose. We have a hangman rope around us all the time. We associate that with being killed by people who are really, really bad. But today, for example, years ago, Madonna apparently said, when I asked her, why do you wear a crucifix around your neck? And she said, I think it's sexy to have a naked man around me all the time. So those are kind of examples where in jewelry, people use that stuff to domesticate it. So the point I was making is simply it's been domesticated. I wasn't drawing a conclusion that we shouldn't wear it or doesn't signify. No, not at all. I've met many, 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 many people, and I ask them, I say, I try to use something they're wearing oftentimes to conversation starter about Jesus. Maybe they have a tattoo, maybe they have a cross necklace or earrings or something. And I'll say, oh, I like your cross. Are you a Christian? They'll go, no. They'll go, no. Well, you do, good. Oh, yeah, there are many, many, many Christians who wear the cross because it represents their Christian. Good. You want people to ask about it. Well, good, I'll keep asking about it, but I already know the answer. But I use as it so many, most of the time when I've asked that question, the answer is no. Or, oh, I mean, my grandmother went to church. It's always my grandmother. I didn't ask you about your grandmother. So that's the only point I was making, is that it's been domesticated. Sorry to bother you. No, I'm glad you asked you. I'm glad you asked. No, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. So the point is, and that's like I gave the example of crosses on our walls. I mean, we do it because we think we're Christians, but also because it's pretty. And look at the pretty cross. Oh, it's pretty. The fact that we think it's pretty at all means we have profoundly domesticated. That's a pretty injection needle. That's a pretty hangman's noose. There's nothing pretty about it. It's a torture. It's horrible. But the fact that I can even say that and mean it, like that's a pretty looking cross. I use the pretty. The adjective should never be used for a cross. But then when we put gold on it and silver and diamonds, oh, that's really pretty. It's a gold encrusted electric chair. And that was my point last week. Is that oh, it looks so it's so pretty, and then we domesticate it. And I think that we missed the shock of that. In the first century world, there's no concept of a pretty cross. There's no concept of wearing a cross as jewelry. That's a dumb, despicable thing to do. You would never, ever be proud of a cross. And so that was the point I was making. The second point was that not only is domesticated, if we were to time travel, we would really hear the punch of that. That when Jesus died on the cross for us, it's a despicable thing. It's shameful. It's the number one stumbling block for the Jew and Gentile in the first century preaching. What are you saying is Messiah died on a cross? Are you a dummy? Nothing good dies on a cross. So, good, good, good. So people associate you with the cross and they give you the gift. That's great. That's great. That's great. That's great. That's great. Anything about Genesis or anything? All right, well, let's commence. So, end of Genesis, we're in Genesis chapter 1. We finished verse 13. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. A third day. So, we finished up. So far, in days 1, 2, and 3, remind you, God has created, that means slash brought to function or brought to bear or established three foundational aspects of existence. Day 1 was time. Time, that was daylight, nighttime, day and night. There were no sun yet. It was night and day, night and day. It's time. 2, he created the weather. So storehouses up there, clouds and whatever weather. And 3, then he created agriculture, where the earth produces plants and the fruit, and then it drops down and more trees are developed. So God has developed, brought into function time, weather, and agriculture. And I love how Walton says this. It's like a king who sets up administration. That's how he governs the structure of the cosmos and their world and their understanding. And then day 4. Can I go ahead? And God said, and I'm doing this from a pretty literal Hebrew translation from David Friedman, Old Testament scholar. And God said, let there be lights in the space of the skies to distinguish between the day and the night. And they will be for signs and for appointed times and for days and years. And let's unpack that a little bit because that's what they're for signs, appointed times, and for days and years. For signs, that is to say, it might be hard to keep grasping this. They're for signs because God will use these objects, these lights in the skies, as signs. They're there to express His will when He wants to use them. For example, if He causes an eclipse, or if it turns to a blood moon, or maybe He just turns off the sun altogether and becomes total darkness. It's the way they're saying God will use those objects that He puts in the firmament, the space of the skies, to use them whenever He wants to use them to communicate a message. They're signs. We think, no, they're not. They're big balls of burning gas a few million miles away, and that's what they know. No, they're not. These are objects God will use whenever He wants to communicate a message to you Israelites or to anyone. And that's what we see in the Old Testament. Many times they might say God caused the sun to stand still, and it went total darkness, or it acts as a sign that God was speaking to us. Now, the ancient world, everyone thought that about those things. Everybody, except they also thought those objects were gods. And so, whenever those things up there did things, the gods were communicating to us. And the Jews saying the same thing. Yep, God's going to use them for signs. They're not used for seasons. If your translation says that, that's wrong. A scholar named W. Vogels, he's demonstrated that mo'adim in Hebrew, it's not seasons like summer or winter, but more specifically, there's appointed times. Appointed times are like festivals and religious feast days of the liturgical calendar. So there's signs and for appointed times. Appointed times, not seasons on the calendar, but like religious seasons, appointed times or events on the liturgical calendar. And he says for days and for years. Yes, time, but chiefly, again, for agricultural seasons and religious seasons. So God will put these things up there that he will use to communicate with us whenever he needs to. Two, that lets us also know how to regulate when we have religious festivals and when it's agricultural season, when it's harvest time, plant season, and so forth. That's the function of these things, not to give us 4 seasons. That's not the Hebrew at all. So that's what he said. Let there be lights in the space, and that's why I'm going to use these signs. So again, you imagine a Jewish father, and it would have been a father telling his son, "Son, you see that up there? God uses those things to help us know when to have harvest, when to make sure it's time for our religious holidays, and so forth. And even we know when it's Shabbat or Sabbath, we know these things. So those things God will use all those things. Really, Daddy? Yeah, every one of them. He'll use those things. In verse 15, he says, "And they would be for lights in the space of the skies to shed light on the earth, and it was so." And notice here that daylight is not understood to have derived from the sun. They're lights in the space of the skies to shed light. They're not the source of daylight, because the text understands that light surrounds us in daytime, and that's an independent creation of God. And that already took place on the first day. On the first day when he said, "Let there be light." So the sun, the moon, the stars, they're light sources. They're like a lamp or a torch, just stronger. That's it. So yeah, they are a flashlight up in there in the skies. They're a flashlight. But the flashlight does not give us daylight. Daylight comes from God, they would say. God makes daylight. And then we have extra bright lights. But God uses those as signs and let us know about how to do our religious holidays and agricultural seasons. But daylight itself is before those things. Any question or comments about those? Very good. So yeah, in Revelation, Revelation 21, it says, "I saw a new heavens, new earth," and so forth. And then he says that this God is the source of light. There'll be no more darkness, and so forth. I agree that what's going on there is a similar idea that the source of light is not an object in space. I'm not convinced in Genesis that daylight comes from God's presence, because they treat it as something God. They perceive that light as something God puts out there rather than he is the source of the light. Revelation, it says he is the source of the light. Does that make sense? But I think the comparison is good in that they both say that it's not a sun that does it. A little footnote. When people die, it's extremely common when they die and come back, if they remember stuff, if they do meet God, they always say, "He's the brightest light you've ever seen your whole life," but you can look right at him. No one else says, "He's kind of brown with blue stripes." They all say it, no matter what their religious background is. So, no, that's good. Yeah, good comparison. So they think those things are objects. Now, let me say one quick word about that. Well, just to make sure I'm probably not doing a great job on this, but I'm trying to make this an undergraduate course. I'm just giving you highlights. In the ancient world, everybody thought those objects in the skies were mini gods or little gods or big gods. We might say the word many because we're so influenced by Judaism and Christianity. But they were beings. And they're beings. And so for a Jew to walk around centuries ago and go, "No, they're not. No, they're not. They're just huge torches." And God uses those things when he wants to. They just shake their head, scratch their head, like, I don't know what you're talking about. Everybody knows those bright things are God's up there. Like, no, they're not. The idea that God just puts them into function, these things that God uses, it is unique in the ancient world. Verse 16, and God made the two big lights, the bigger light for the regulation of the day, and the smaller light for the regulation of the night, and the stars. Notice, of course, the bigger light for the regulation of the day, not for daylight. In verse 17, and God set them in the space of the skies to shed light on the earth, and to regulate the day and the night, and to distinguish between the light and the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. A fourth day. A few things here. The Hebrew word translated lights in your Hebrew, in your translation, verse 16, me'orot. It's not used often in the Old Testament. In fact, it's about 19 times total. And what's intriguing is that in the 10 occurrences outside of Genesis and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, they all refer to the light of a lampstand that lights up the tabernacle. It's a particular Hebrew word for that particular thing that lights up the tabernacle. And later on, as I'll talk about, as John Walton does and a few others, and this is part of his arguments to believe that an ancient Jew would have heard this as God setting up basically a cosmic temple in which God will rule over. He could use different words for lights, but he used the particular word used for the light that lights up a tabernacle. That might be telling. Also, of course, he says he made the lights. Made can mean different things. It could be God manufactured, maybe. It could also mean something like God speaks, and the result of his proclamation is that the celestial bodies are assigned their functions. I made that thing do that thing, and I made that thing do that thing, and I made that thing do that thing. I lean that direction. Then there's day 5, verse 20. And God said, let the waters swarm with a swarm of living beings, and let birds fly over the earth on the face of the space of the skies. And God created the big sea serpents. I'll come back to that one, your translation. Big sea serpents, and all the living beings that creep, with which the waters swarm, by their kinds, and every winged bird by its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the skies, and let the birds multiply in the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. A few reflections on this 5th day. Here, God is filling up the spaces that he has brought into be, that he's quote-unquote created. He's filling up the water below. He's filling up the skies. He's filling up the land. So these are 3 major areas. Remember, it's a 3-tier cosmos, basically. Water, land, sky. Now, there's super, super duper sky where heavens, where God is, but it's the same Hebrew word. Here he's saying God is populating all of them. You know, of course, and he wants these living creatures to be fruitful, multiply. That is, to fill up everything. You have freedom to fill up the whole space. And this proliferation of the living creatures is not a curse. We might think that when we're around fleas and rodents. And we'll see in a second, all of these living beings, the exact Hebrew word living beings, will be set up to be subservient to humans. So this isn't a curse. This is the way it is. They populate everything. We'll see in a second. But yet they serve the needs of humans. Okay, let me just talk. What's probably most controversial / confusing are these big sea serpents in verse 21. Is that what your translation says? What is your sea creatures? Holman, okay. What do else have? Great creatures of the sea. Yeah. So sea serpents is right. Now the exact Hebrew word is tanin. So this is where context, so many times, context helps us so much. Just in Genesis, notice that of all the subgroups, the generalized groups of crawling things and flying things, tanin, it's demarcated, it's singled out of a generic crowd. That's interesting. 2, what's interesting is the text comes back to the word bara, which means to create. He created them. verse 21, he created these tanin. And that's the first time bara, create, has been used since verse 1. So they stand out as a subgroup to the created, and that really stands out. Now, when we look up tanin in the ancient world and you compare all the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, it fits a very common theme. That, as I showed on, there we go, see the picture up there down below, these serpent figures, it's part of an ancient, well, the word we use in scholarship is myth, but myth doesn't mean it's all pretend. It just means a narrative to explain origins. And so it's a very common idea in the ancient world that these cosmic sea monsters there was a struggle between the gods, and the one down low in the sea lost. And so the god who won the battle, like in Enuma Elish, when Tiamat and Marduk fought it out, the one that won the battle got the land and the sea. What's interesting here is they're not gods. God creates them. Just like those objects in the skies, everyone thought those were gods or some kind of beings. Not in Genesis. In Genesis, these tanin are not gods. There's no struggle with God. Having said that, there are little baby allusions to how these tanin are vanquished. For example, if we wanted to look at they're called Rahab in Isaiah 51:9. This tanin is called Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1. Psalm 74:13-14. In Psalm 74:13-14, this Leviathan is a multi-headed beast, and he's called a tanin. A tanin. So what's going on here is this is not, God made fish, insects and animals and birds. Oh, and ancient dinosaurs. This is not going on. He's filling up all the spaces. And if you're an ancient person, you think water, land, and sky. Yeah, Daddy, but what about the original water that's still there? The water that he pushed back that surrounds the earth, the big bubble. Remember the big bubble? What about there? Oh, yeah, the tanin. Should we be scared of them, Daddy? Not at all. But I thought God, my friend at school, he said that those were gods and that God had to beat them up to get them. Nope, that's false. They're not gods. They're not scary to God at all. God made these things and he has full authority over them. A little footnote, if you remember your Bible well, in Exodus chapter 7, verses 9-12, Moses takes Aaron and he's in front of the Egyptian court. Do you remember that? And he says he's threatening, he's battling it out with these other priests. That's right. And so he takes the staff, and the typical translation, he turns to a snake. It's not a snake, it's to a tanin. So these are these ancient kind of an Egyptian magician staff does the same thing. It's this ancient chaos creature. And the fact that they turn into a tanin demonstrates these are, better word, they're pagans. That using a tanin is, these guys represent this chaos. There's something very much against God, what he wants. So this creature that's there is referenced a few times again throughout the Hebrew Bible. Not tons of times, but it is called a tanin. And it references an ancient idea of these serpentine-like creatures that they had in common with their neighbors, but the Jews said, yeah, but they're not gods. God created them, and they're not a threat to him. So let me pause there. Any questions or comments about tanin? Oh, the Hebrew T-A-N, I think it's two N's. Yeah, T-A-N-N-I-N. T-A-N-N-I-N. Uh-huh. Yes, ma'am. Good. Is that the same Hebrew word as a serpent that pulled up that people looked at? If I remember correctly, no. If I remember correctly, it's a good question. If I remember correctly, no. That's what stands out also in Exodus, that it's tanin, of all the things it could have been. They have other Hebrew words for serpents or snakes. Well, we'll see in Genesis 2, that serpentine creature is not a tanin. It's a different, and even then, I don't think the point is not because it's a snake, but I'll talk about that when we get there. But it is the word can be translated snake or serpent, no doubt. Good question. So this is part of their ancient cosmology. This is an ancient person. If you time travel and ask the ancient Jew, we're just going to have different views. We just, unless maybe you do think there's ancient cosmic waters below the earth. And I don't. They thought, well, sure, everybody knows that. But what we know about this from their view, of course, is that God is not threatened by these creatures. They're not foreign gods. They're not other gods. But we do have allusions to God dominating these Tanin, like in Isaiah 27:1, Psalm 74, and so forth. So there you go. You'll oftentimes hear that say that's what God made, ancient dinosaurs. You can believe that. I mean, nobody in scholarship does. They don't know what a dinosaur is. They don't know what they are. They have no concept in the answer what a dinosaur is. There's no word for it. Day 6, chapter 1, verse 24. And God said, let the earth bring out living beings by their kind. Domestic animal, that's one category. Creeping thing, another category. And 3, wild animals of the earth by their kind. And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth by their kind, the domestic animals by their kind, every creeping thing, the ground by their kind, and God saw that it was good. So here, rather than differentiate animals by phyla or species, that we're inclined to do, the categories they divide into are 3 different kinds of things. The behema, domesticated animals, remesh, the herd animals that often serve as prey, and then the haya, the wild predatory animals. You might not like that they do it that way, but they sure do. Son, there are 3 different kinds of animals. The kinds we eat, the kinds that eat the ones we eat, and then just wild ones. Daddy, what's a woman? No one knows. No one knows. They're in the... Just kidding, Sharon. That's just joke. These inhabit the region of the dry land, and the earth brings them forth, in the same way that the earth brought forth vegetation in verse 12. In verse 12. They don't tell us how he did it, what he did, what the mechanism was. He just said, let the earth bring it forth. That's what happened. So animals came from the earth. Any question about that? This is the next one. It's going to take a little time. Anything else? Feel free to ask questions or comments. Correct. Is that like saying omnivore, herbivore, predator? I don't think so. Yeah, you would have to make sure that every single animal that we eat or is domesticated is only a certain kind of herbivore and omnivore. I don't think that's true. So they're more about related to how we relate to the animals than they are. No, good question. At least that's my view. I don't think that's the same categories. Anything else? Is your silence because it's not clicking or you got it or what? I mean, hold on a second. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Good. Oh, good. So, is God, the earth brought forth animals, living creatures, is that the same as when God brings Adam out of the earth? Very astute observation. Answer is yes. Yes. And we'll see it because the ancient Jewish person very much connected humans with all living creatures, what I'll say in just a second. It's the exact same Hebrew word. They're a living creature. But there's one distinction. And it's a biggie. And we'll talk about it in a second. That's right. That's right. It's very important because they did not think humans were angels or deity, divine figures. They did not think. Good. Verse 26. And God said, let us make a human in our image, according to our likeness, and let them dominate. Listen, the word is dominate. That's a good translation. The fish of the sea, the birds of the skies, and the domestic animals, and all the earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. So Ralphie's told us, I'm going to unpack this a little bit. Let us make humans, and their role is going to be to dominate all the animals. That's it. That's the goal. Someone's got to be in charge of all these animals. Verse 27, And God created the human in his image. If you ain't sure where they go, oh, of course, of course. And I'll talk about that in a second. He created it in the image of God. He created them, male and female. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. They're subduing the earth. But they dominate the fish of the sea and the birds of the skies and every animal that creeps on the earth. Those are different Hebrew words. They subdue the earth. They dominate the creatures. Verse 29, and God said, here, I have placed all the vegetation that produces seed that is on the face of the earth for you, and every tree which has in its fruit of a tree producing seed, it will be food for you, and for all the wild animals of the earth, and for all the birds of the skies, and for all the creeping things on the earth, everything in which there is a living being, every plant of vegetation for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he made, and here it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. So God has been so far separating things. He separated the water above and below. He made light. He made time, so light and dark, light and dark. Then he made land. When he blew that bubble up, blows the bubble up. And as he fills with the bubble, there's nothing there. So he has to fill it up with things. He says, earth, bring forth vegetation. Boom, all these fruits and all those trees and all the stuff blinds up. All right, now let's get some animals up in there. So he has animals come up out of it. And they come from the earth because they all die and go back to the earth. Living things come from the earth because they're all related to it. Later on, Adam will be, from the dust you shall go. I'll talk about that later on. So, and now the last thing is someone's got to be in control of all this stuff I just made. Now, it's ultimately for God, but someone's got to be God's viceroy, God's authority figure who rules over it. And he says, in that case, let's make humans. Oh, let me say a little bit about that. Actually, a lot about that. A few things, and then hopefully I'll hit your frequently asked questions, and if I haven't, you talk to me. What does it mean by let us make? Let us make. Sounds like God's more than one God. Okay. In typical Christian church circles, what we want to say is let us make means the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. That's a typical way to interpret that. I'm absolutely unpersuaded by that, and every Old Testament scholar is. And the reason why is ancient Jews had no concept of a Trinity. There's no concept of a Spirit and Son being independent persons from God. And the only way I can say about that is you just need evidence for it. And there's no concept in the ancient world. It doesn't mean the Trinity did not exist, no more than black holes didn't exist when they wrote this story. Yeah, black holes existed. They didn't know about them. They didn't know about quantum mechanics. We still don't know much about it either, but they still existed. They didn't know about the laws of gravity. There's all kinds of things that existed they didn't know about, and they didn't know about the Trinity. So, huh? The tree hook? The neutrinos, thank you. Or neutrinos. They didn't know about neutrinos, which are so small, by the way, they can travel through the earth and never touch an atom. You're welcome for that extra trivia. That was worth the price of admission. You're welcome. I'm full of that nonsense, full of it. So let me spare you some time. There are different ways to think about the us, but in a nutshell, almost all Old Testament scholars concur on this. In the ancient Near East, the heavenly court was a divine assembly made up of their chief gods of the pantheon. A pantheon means a God committee. That's a God committee. And it was this group that made decisions and fixed destinies. In the Old Testament, there's also a heavenly court, but it's made up of angels. More specifically, the Hebrew is sons of God. Sons of God. And if you want, on your own, or we can do it now if you want, but just look these Bible verses up if you don't believe me. And this is all through the Old Testament. Here's a few examples. 1 Kings 22, 19 to 22. So 1 Kings 22, 19 to 22 explicitly refers to this. Of course, Isaiah 14, 13. Isaiah 14:13. In Job 1, God is with the sons of God, and one of the members of this council is a being who does not have a name. He has a job title. His job title is Ha-Satan, means the accusing one. He's a prosecuting attorney. Doesn't have a name. It's not a name because Ha-Satan, the definite article, you don't use that when you have names in Hebrew. So it says the prosecuting attorney of the heavenly council comes up to God and says, hey, I know a guy. He doesn't trust, he don't have faith in you. He just has faith because he has all this stuff. Take away all this stuff and see what happens. So this heavenly counsel is assumed throughout the Old Testament. The difference is it is assumed. So I mean, I give you many, many references. There's a couple key differences. One is God does God might consider things with them, but God does not depend upon them to make decisions. So God convenes the assembly in their theology, but then he tells them what's going to happen. They can have input, but he tells them what's going to happen. That is to say, in Judaism, God does not share his authority or sovereignty. He doesn't share it. So it's like with those ancient cosmic creatures that go, well, yeah, they're there, but they're not gods, and God created them, and they're not a threat. So almost certainly what's going on here is if you're an ancient person and you think what God is doing when he makes decisions, everyone thought God or gods would have convened his council together and then made a decision. We don't think that way. I don't think that way at all. But in the ancient world, thousands of years ago, yes, they did, and everyone did. Everybody did. Again, one more time, the difference was God did not use them to make decisions. He did not need them to make decisions. But we see this throughout the Old Testament text, that this idea of a divine council being there. Yes, sir. Am I totally ruling out the idea that God might inspire that us be put in there? Oh, no, sir, I'm not talking about inspiration. I'm talking about um, the people who wrote this story. Do I think God inspired them? Sure, you could say God inspired all of this story, every word of it. So for me, maybe after because of time, for me, inspiration doesn't tell me how to interpret it. And so, since I do think God worked through people in the ancient context to communicate in a way they would understand, I want to understand how they would have understood it. So He didn't write this for me. I heard that in church a lot. The Word of God written for you. No, it is not written for me. It was written for ancient Jews. English didn't exist when they wrote this. Hebrew didn't exist, before long. So it wasn't written for me. I'm eavesdropping on a conversation, a very ancient conversation of a foreign land, of a foreign language. I think, what do they mean when they said those words? So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that ancient context, not whether it was inspired or not. So I do think God used it to communicate messages in their worldview about God. And how they said, there's no counsel. No, I think they were not fully understand that. Much like if you time traveled 500 years ago, well, like it is today, kind of. But let's say it's 12th century AD, in medieval times. You go to England, and you go, who's in charge here? What's really a lot? Everyone votes. It's like the ancient Greek cities, a democracy. No, it's not. We have a monarch. No, what are you smoking? I don't understand. No. What happens is they all convene. They have a ballot. They get these votes. You know what I mean, don't you? They go, you don't vote. What's a vote? What? That guy over there in the gal in that castle? They tell us what to do. That doesn't make any sense. So how would I talk about God and that assumption that that's how the world works? And they seem to do it this way. Anyway, it's throughout the Old Testament. I got to move ahead. Is that okay? Real quickly. So it seems to be the case that us means it's just that that he's referencing his declaration to his assembly. That ancient person I had no problem with. Image of God. Let's make them in the image of God. In the ancient world, image was believed in some ways to carry the essence of the thing it represented. So the deity's work worked through the object. It was accomplished through an idol. And the image of God, and of course the shalom, the image, it's not a representation necessarily of the physical form, what the God looks like, but as a physical manifestation of that God's ability to rule, God's ability to reflect the attributes. It's not the same. We don't have something just like this, but if you have, say, an American flag, it's like that. If I went to a foreign land, you have foreign embassies, and you have the American, if you go to a consulate there, and in those walls, that's United States of America. So if you attack them, you've attacked America. Well, how do you know that? Because the American flag is there and because of the title and so forth. So when you're in that realm, that flag represents the essence of the White House and the Constitution. In a similar way, they believe that the gods had images, and you have those images, they can be broken up and bifurcated in different parts. So I can have an idol of a god here in Sheffield and Neponset, that's the worst. Cambridge, okay. Chicago, and it's not God's, it may be the same image, but God's been fragmented. And so his essence and power is present at all these locations at one time. Kind of like the American flag set up all over different places, kind of like that. The difference is the American flag doesn't have power and all that stuff. But because the God is represented in that idol that sits over there and there in your house and different Sheffield, you'd be real nice to that God and pour oil on that God's head and feed that God food and water and so forth because the essence of the God is represented in that. Now, everybody thought that in the ancient world. That's as widespread as they believe the earth was a disc. Everybody thought that. There's some key distinctions, though, and this is a big, big deal that, and it seems to me, well, I'm not fussing, but I am fussing. This is never preached correctly. It is never, ever, ever preached correctly because we don't have scholars on the pulpit. In the ancient Near East, that's not bizarre. What's bizarre is everybody thought, almost everyone thought, there were creatures that had the image of the gods, and they were kings. Kings. Kings were made in the image of gods. That's why the kings represented the gods' ruling or governing authority to subdue the territories. And so when you see a king, you recognize that, oh, that guy, Pharaoh, well, Pharaoh just means the great house. It's not a guy's name. It's like saying the White House. That's what Pharaoh means, the great. So the emperor, the leader, the king, who we'll call the Pharaoh, he represents, say, the sun god Ra, Ra's authority over the dominion of Egypt. And so he bears the image of God. What's so bizarre, and it is unique in the ancient world, is verse 28. What did God put in the image of God? Verse 28, what did he put as the image of God? This is church, you can say it. Don't say Jesus. Huh? Verse 28, who did God make an image of God? I can't hear you. Humans. God made humans in the image of God. So God made male and female. So what is unique in the ancient world, and no one thought this way, was that Genesis, the author of Genesis is saying, when you see any human, you see a walking flagpole. Or to use their analogy, you see a walking image of God. Not that you look like God necessarily. It's not that as to say you represent God's essence to rule over the creation, which is precisely what he said I did. I want to make humans so they dominate the created order, all the animals, and subdue the land. And if you're an ancient person, this is why I said this when I was reading the translation, and I said, an image of God. I go, of course they were. Of course they were. Because in the ancient world, they would have said, of course they were. Whoever is made in the image of God's rule over. They subdue the territory. But Jude says, yeah, not just kings. Everybody. If any human you ever see, ever, humanity in general, is to be God, the real God's ambassador and his essence and power to rule over. Let me say a couple quick things about that as well. Now notice this is very different from all philosophical and theological interpretations throughout Christian history, that what it means to be made in the image of God is that you can reason, you have conscience, you have morality, self-awareness, all those things. Now God gives us those things to rule. Sure he does. He does. He gives us those things, but that's not the point of Genesis. It's just not. And so the amount of ink that has been spilled on that topic of what it might mean and all the debate, Genesis has nothing to do with whether or not we're conscious or moral creatures. He said it in order to subdue. So image of God, they think, ruling over and subduing. The kings were, not the kings, you, everybody is. Now God gives us the characteristics of consciousness, self-awareness, morality in our rulership, sure. Sure, but the point is not that. The point is that We're the ones who are overseeing it. And notice too that the subduing applies to the broader world of nature. Subduing is nature. We rule over specifically creatures, and that encourages domestication or control to populate the earth. Um, in the ancient world, the natural world was regularly granted. The natural world in the ancient world, when they saw the things, whose job was it to oversee land and sea and sky? They would have said, the gods. Everybody said that. The author of Genesis says, nope, us. We're the ones. So if you paraphrase it, it might sound like this. Here's what I want you to do, humans. Have a lot of children and populate the earth. Harness its potential and use its resources for your benefit. That's it. It doesn't mean ruin it, doesn't mean destroy it. The earth doesn't mean worship the earth, doesn't mean treat it like fragile china. Christians do not worship the planet. We can hug trees. Dustin loves to hug trees. He's a big tree hugger. You didn't know that about him. Nobody knew about it until this very second. I made that up. That is not what Christians are supposed to do, is hug. I mean, we can hug it, but we're not supposed to worship the earth. Earth is a thing we use. It's not a god. It's not full of gods. Another thing that really, really stands out, so we have the authority to do that. Another thing that stands out, in the ancient Near East, humans, and every single story you read, Egyptian, Canaanite, Babylonian, humans were created to serve the needs of the gods. The gods were hungry. They were thirsty, and they created humans to be slaves or servants of the gods. That's the whole purpose. But in Genesis, that's not at all what we're there. And this is a big difference. It's not a function of Genesis. So Genesis turns us around. Instead of us providing the needs of God for food, God provides humans source for food. We're not giving food to God. He's the giver of food, not the receiver of it. So we might say we serve the needs of God, God's will, and Christians get this wrong all the time. Benefit the doubt, they do. They say, I'm serving God. No, you're not. You're serving the will of God. That's not the same. God has no needs that you can serve. Period. He's not prayer deficient. Now I'm better. Finally, Sharon prayed. I was getting weak there for a second. I mean, it doesn't happen. He has no needs. He has a will, and you can serve his will or not. Well, I'm going to pause there. Next time we're going to talk about male and female and whatever those words mean. We'll come back to that later on, okay? Thank you, Lord Jesus, for a time to study. Help us put this into practice. Thank you for creating us and the world, Jesus. Amen.